In addition to all the automatic controls included by Genexus in the applications it generates, sometimes users request that we make some specific controls. In transactions, the rules that must be complied with, or the controls that we are asked to validate, are defined in the Rules section. If, for example, a requirement is not to allow storing of clients without a name, we have a rule called error that will enable us to avoid that. So we type error, open brackets, and between single quotation marks, we enter the text we want to have displayed in the event that the user tries to leave a client name blank. We close brackets, and now we only have to indicate the condition that must be met for the text to be displayed. The condition is that the customer name attribute is empty. So we write if customer name, period, and here we select is empty. All the rules we state must end with a semicolon, so we add it. We save, and we press F5 to see this rule at runtime. We run the customer transaction, and if we leave the client name blank and leave the field, the text we defined is displayed. The error rule, despite letting us move to the next field, including when the condition is met, will not let us save. This is the default behavior. We can change this to make it so the error rule never lets us edit the next field. This is due to a property that we won't cover here. If another requirement involved preventing the client's surname from being left blank, a similar rule would also have to be stated. So we copy and paste this rule definition. We replace name with last name, and we change the attribute involved. We press F5, run customer, and we leave the client's name empty. And we can see the error associated with the blank name is displayed. We enter Paul, and we try to leave the surname empty, and the error associated with the blank surname is now displayed. Now, there's another rule whose syntax is very similar to that of the error rule. It's called message. And the only difference with error is that if the condition is met, the message is displayed as a notice or warning, and the user can continue working. If, for example, we want to inform that the client's phone number has been left blank, but without forcing the user to enter it, we can create a message rule, open brackets, enter the text between single or double quotation marks, the phone is empty. We close brackets, and next we define the condition for the rule to be executed. If customer phone, period, is empty, and we type a semicolon to complete the rule definition. We press F5 to try this functionality. Note that if we leave the phone blank and try to leave the field, the message that we created is displayed. In this case, it's orange, and we can move on. Now, let's suppose that our users at the travel agency have told us that they are interested in storing the date on which each customer is added. So we need to create a new attribute in the customer transaction to store this date. We enter customer added date of data type, and now we would only have to automatically assign it today's date. We go to the rules section and select a rule called default. This rule allows us to start an attribute or variable with a value. In this way, the syntax of the default rule has been inserted. Now we will replace the attribute between brackets with the attribute that we want to initialize, which is customer added date, and we will also add the value that we want it to use, which is today's date. Ampersand today is a predefined variable that always has today's date loaded in order to use it. A variable is one space in memory with an associated symbolic name and a data type that can be stored. Text, numbers, dates, and so on. This variable has a certain value stored. In general, the variable name is used to make reference to the stored value. An attribute, on the other hand, is one value physically stored in the database. Most Genexus objects allow defining variables. These variables are local, which means that they can only be used within each object. To make reference to a variable, the ampersand symbol must be used. For example, ampersand total. If we open the variable selector within a transaction, we will see that a set of variables has already been defined. They are system variables, such as, for example, ampersand today, ampersand mode, and so on. In particular, the ampersand today variable allows obtaining the current date taken from the system. In addition to these system variables, developers can also create their own variables, user variables. For example, a myDate variable of date type. When creating variables, these options are available. Create them through the variable selector included in all Genexus objects, as we've just done, or create them at the time they will be used in the place they are needed. For example, type the ampersand symbol to indicate that a variable name comes next, followed by the variable name. Lastly, click on the name given to the variable and right-click to select this option from the context menu, Add Variable. We can see that the variable properties are edited. Now we can assign it a data type. It has been added to the variable selector, and we can see it in there. The third option is to select Insert from the menu bar, and then Variable, and New Variable. In the example here, the default rule is used to assign the current date to the customer added date attribute by default. Now we save and press F5. We're notified that the new attribute, customer added date, will be added to the customer table. We click on Reorganize, and once again, we have the application ready to be executed. We click on Customer, and we can see that the new added date attribute is already started with today's date. If we hadn't entered the default rule, the date field would be empty as the other fields. We enter a customer, Robert Hill, who lives on 81st Street. His phone number is 760-5100, and his email address is rhill@example.com. And note that today's date is suggested, but we can change it. If the users at the travel agency were interested in allowing the date to be edited, preventing future dates from being entered, we could create an error rule. We open brackets and type, the date must be lower or equal than today. Close brackets, and add the condition if customer added date is more than today. To try this at runtime, we press F5. We enter Alex Johnson, and if we try to enter a date higher than today, the condition that we defined is met and the associated error is displayed. Now, Let's suppose that our users at the travel agency have told us that the date a client was added cannot be edited. It must be shown as disabled in the form and saved as suggested by the application. To meet this request, we would have to remove this rule because it no longer makes sense. Also, we would have to state a new rule, no except. We replace the text attribute or variable between brackets with the attribute customer added date, and we delete if condition because we want this rule to always be executed. So far, we've been writing the attribute names by heart, and this can lead to errors. To avoid this, one option we have is to insert the attributes from the Options menu. To do so, we select Insert and then Attribute, or use the shortcut Ctrl-Shift-A. In this way, we'll access a list of all the attributes declared in our KB, where we can filter by name and insert the selected attribute. The other option is to start typing the attribute name, for example, customer, and press Ctrl-Space. Using this shortcut, we'll be shown all the objects in our KB that start with that name. And if we click on the attribute we need, it'll be inserted. These ways of selecting the attribute instead of writing it allow us to save time and avoid typing errors. Let's go back. Now let's try this behavior. F5. And as we can see, the date is initialized by the default rule and disabled by the no except rule. We've seen that to initialize the customer added date attribute with today's date, we have to define this default rule. It's important to know that every default rule that we define will be executed only when we're adding records. This is to say, if we query a customer that was already saved, the default rule will not be executed, because this customer already has an insertion date and the default rule doesn't overwrite it. Now, let's suppose that instead of defining the default rule, we made this assignment. By defining this rule, the customer added date attribute would always be assigned with today's date. This is an assignment rule, and it'll always be executed regardless if the user is inserting or updating data, and so on. A condition can be added to an assignment rule so that it's executed only when the user is performing a certain action in the database, such as an insertion, an update, or a deletion. Let's do this. We type if insert. The behavior of the rule defined in this way will be the same as that of the default rule, because now we've conditioned the assignment to be made only if a record is being inserted. This is what the default rule does. Just like a rule can be conditioned with if insert, we can condition rules to be executed, if update, or if delete as well. Something important to note and learn is that the order in which rules are defined doesn't necessarily match the order in which they will be executed. This set of rules could be stated in any other order, and the result at runtime would be exactly the same, because Genexus decides when each one of the defined rules should be triggered. Finally, remember that each transaction may need to have its own behavior rules defined. In this case, we've defined rules in the client's transaction to check the behavior that we were asked to control when users interact with the client's details. Most likely, the agency wants to control certain rules or behavior for attractions as well, or for another transaction. To this end, each transaction has its own rules section. Now let's briefly look at a situation that arises in the country transaction. In previous videos, when we created the second level named City in this transaction, Genexus generated the country city table in the database. As we saw, the primary key of this table is made up of two attributes, country ID and city ID. Remember that both the country ID attribute and the city ID attribute have been assigned the ID domain, which has been defined as auto-numbered. When this table was created, Genexus triggered a warning indicating that the city ID attribute's auto-number property, set to true, would be ignored. Why did this happen? Because the auto-number property only applies to simple primary keys, that is to say, to those made up of a single attribute, not to compound primary keys, as in this case, made up of two attributes, country ID and city ID. To automatically number a second level, we'll use the serial rule. For this, let's go to the rules section of the country transaction and insert the serial rule. As a first parameter, we'll be asked to enter an attribute, which will be the one to number automatically. Therefore, we enter city ID. As a second parameter, we'll be asked to enter another attribute, which will be in charge of saving the last value assigned to the attribute we want to number automatically. In this case, city ID. For this, we'll create a new attribute which must be at the level above the one we want to number. We return to the transaction structure and create it on the first level of the transaction. We'll call it country last line, and it'll be of numeric type. So as to be able to save the changes, we'll partially comment the code entered in the rules section, because it's still incomplete and does not allow saving. Now we save, uncomment the rule, and enter as second parameter the country last line attribute. Finally, this rule asks us to enter a numerical value, which will correspond to the automatic number increment. We enter the value 1, and this way, the city ID numbering will be incremented one by one. We save the changes made and run the application. We are asked to reorganize the database to add the country last line attribute in the country table. And we confirm. We open the country transaction and access Germany. And in city, we won't enter an ID value. We'll only enter its name, in this case, Berlin. After choosing the city ID, we press Tab, and when leaving the field, we see that this city has been assigned city ID value 1. The attribute country last line has the same value. Remember that this attribute is in charge of saving the last value entered in city ID. Let's try to enter another city. So we enter Hamburg. Again, when we leave the city ID field with the tab key without writing anything, the ID was automatically assigned a value, in this case, 2. And the country last line attribute took this last value once again. If we enter a third city, based on the serial rule we created, Genexus will take the value of the country last line attribute. It'll add 1, since it's the increment value we defined, and the resulting value will be assigned to city ID and country last line, and so on. If we consider the behavior of the rules that we've seen so far, we might think that they're only executed on the client, since, as we saw in the case of the error rule in the client's name, as soon as the user leaves the field, leaving it empty, the message is triggered. However, the user can continue filling the other fields, and when he presses confirm, then the part of the program associated with the transaction executed on the server is the one that takes control. The rule is triggered again, and in this case, because it's precisely the error rule, it prevents the record from being saved in the database table. Therefore, the rules we've seen are validated both in the client, this is called client-side validation, and also in the server. We could disable the execution of rules on the client, but we won't be able to disable their execution on the server, which is the one that really controls what will be done in the database. We should keep in mind that the browser is a hostile environment, which could be subject to attacks that send tampered information to the server. The server is the one that must have ultimate control over the data. The rules in the client are executed to provide a good user experience so that the user feels that the application is always operating. Therefore, the same rules are incorporated both in the program running on the front end, the part that maintains the status and the business logic, as the representative of the server on the client, and in the program itself on the back end. In other words, in the business logic validation. Understanding this will be important later, when we add a little complexity to what we can control from the rules. Lastly, we save the changes in GX Server.